I look forward to doing this quite a bit more often. We can get you in on the radio and on TV and keep this dialogue going.
Great. Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much.
So, Mark, are you with us?
I am. Good evening.
Wow, it's amazing. Technology works occasionally. So welcome back to the show. So you and I talked a little bit before the show. I guess you've got a couple things going on in the world, so let's get right into it.
First of all, that was a good program, and I just have to say that I'm also an artist. I'm in a band, and we had a whole discussion this afternoon about these same topics, and not so much focused on activists, but on artists in the community who we feel are being ignored largely by our own society. So it's very sad to see really talented people just struggling to survive. So kudos for those new ideas about how to change things. Here in Seattle, I have a good news story to report, which is that Mayor Mike McGinn decided to end the drone program. The Seattle Police Department had introduced their drone program last Tuesday, but by Thursday, after a very contentious city council meeting and previous public hearings that were disrupted by protests, the mayor and the police chief came out on Thursday and said, you know what, we are just going to totally drop this whole program. And one of the interesting things I thought about that was the city council's legislation to regulate the use of drones pointed at the very beginning of that document to the fact that aviation industry corporations had really been pushing this idea, kind of hard selling the local law enforcement agencies to accept these drones. However, the drones that the Seattle Police Department had were actually federally funded. They were funded by the U.S. government. So
they actually have some sitting in a hangar somewhere.
Oh, they've already introduced them publicly, and there are photos. I did a.
So have they been flying around, and people have been kind of watching them?
Well, we haven't passed that threshold for the FAA yet, right? There's still limitations on drones in our airspace right now, I think.
They had applied for permission to fly them, and that didn't seem to be a problem, actually. They seemed to be pretty confident that was going to happen. What they were talking about, though, was, basically came down to a civil liberties issue. And as far as the drones, they had already publicly unveiled them. So there's a photo. If you go to YouTube, and I posted my Free Speech Radio News report about it, and there's a photo of the Seattle Police Department drone. But they are going to have to return them now, actually, to the federal government, and because that was on a grant from the feds. So now they're going to have to return them.
So this is your opportunity there, guys. There's probably going to be some drones for sale cheap on Craigslist around the country.
Well, part of what was interesting about the story, too, is that this is only one of 50 cities around the country that are considering flying drones. So this is not, Seattle is not the only place, and, this is an ongoing discussion in a lot of other communities around the country. And then, you have to link it just mentally to and psychologically to the drones that are being used to actually assassinate people in Yemen and Pakistan. So although these were supposedly unarmed, drones, which they seem to be, it's still those, I think, two ideas are associated in people's minds. And then there's also the problem with having them used for surveillance at political demonstrations, which pretty much everyone was convinced they would be used for.
So they actually used them up in Seattle. They had a demonstration and the drones flew around. Or is this in other cities, or is this hypothetical?
I'm just saying that was one of the major reasons why the ACLU and other civil rights groups were up in arms about the idea, because they just didn't believe that the police department, even with legislation limiting their use by the city council, they just didn't, believe that they would not be used at political demonstrations. It just seemed like an obvious thing that they were going to do that.
Yeah.
So,
because if you combine that with face recognition software, they can just fly the thing around, take continuous photographs, and figure out everybody who was there, put you on the list, and et cetera. So a lot of this is about collecting lists.
Exactly. They do have face recognition software on them. So that's part of their technology. And just as a kind of interesting segue from that, dealing with surveillance, I wanted to let folks know that there is a story in The Guardian right now which is really interesting about a Raytheon software project where they have developed something called RIOT, R-I-O-T, and what it is mainly meant to do is to track people through social networking websites to the point where, through following GPS coordinates and things like that, they feel that they can actually predict where you're going to be next. So that's kind of spooky. It reminds me of that movie,
Majority Report.
Yes.
Yeah.
Where there's basically it's very interesting that they chose the word riot, but it's for rapid information overlay technology. And the thing is that Raytheon is the 5th largest defense contractor in the world, by the way. But they, according to the U.S. government's Trade Controls Department, the technology has been designated as something called EAR 99, item under export regulations, which means it can, quote, be shipped without a license to most destinations under most circumstances.
Wait, what is this that could be shipped?
So the point
the
was
RIOT
that
software?
this software, according to the U.S. government Trade Controls Department, has been designated under a designation called EAR 99, EAR 99. It's an item under export regulations, and that means that it can be shipped without a license to most destinations under most circumstances. So there's very, very little restriction on distributing the software around the world. So who knows where it's going to end up, is what I'm saying. Okay, here's the official statement from Jan.
That's right.
Jared Adams. RIOT is a big data analytics system design we are working on with industry, national labs, and commercial partners to help turn massive amounts of data into usable information to help meet our nation's rapidly changing security needs.
Rapidly changing in that we haven't quite got everybody under 24-hour surveillance, and this is yet another way to achieve that goal.
Yeah, it's wonderful newspeak.
Yeah.
It's really sad, that we expend that level of resources. We were talking a little bit earlier, with the Kindista people about values, and that's where the values are in the society today. Those kinds of jobs pay really well.
It is a major part of the economy, and it's also a lot of black budget stuff that we don't even know. The series in the Washington Post was extraordinary. What was it, last year, about Secret America, and they were talking about how some management people within those private intelligence corporations didn't even know what their own people were working on. They weren't allowed to see the budget, crazy things like that. So that's a whole other issue. And so when people say, well, this is terrible, it's the man cracking down on us and blah, 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 I say, well, you can see it in several different ways, but I would see it more as an economic thing. I mean, really, there's a lot of money to be made in surveillance and intelligence at this point. So why not? I'm not saying, I'm not promoting it or defending it. I'm just saying the corporate people who are profit-driven, they don't care necessarily about your politics, but if there's money in it, why not? From their point of view, let's do this. Let's build drones. Let's surveil everybody, because we're getting paid by the government huge amounts to do this. So why not? So
speaking of surveilling people, I guess you have some other stuff that's going on up there in terms of surveillance of activists in your area.
Yes, there's an ongoing story that we've been talking about the Seattle Federal Grand Jury, which is another one of those stories which is not getting any coverage. However, I would point people to a recent article in The Stranger, an alternative magazine in Seattle, which actually did a pretty good job. Brendan Kiley wrote about their use of solitary confinement on these activists, which is a very serious issue that no one's talking about. What are the human rights issues involved here? If there's a thought police right now, it's in the political parties and in the media, because I encounter all the time stories that I just cannot get published, that I just can't get reported. Except for Free Speech Radio News and folks like you guys, there's really very little I can do to get stories like this federal grand jury out. And that's frustrating. And so it comes down to there are just certain subjects that are not going to be reported. By the way, that's not, once again, it may be less conspiratorial and political and more economic driven, that these are not the stories that are, getting tons of hits on the websites. They would rather report on, the Super Bowl or something. But there's also, in the Stranger article, there's actually a really good reference to a study that was done about the physiological and psychological effects of solitary confinement. And it's also tied in with a national review that is currently happening of the U.S. prison system's use of solitary confinement. So it's a bigger story, but unfortunately these folks are not really being highlighted in that story. But as far as I know, there are still 3 people, Matthew Duran, Maddie Pfeiffer, and Catherine Oljanik, who are being held in solitary confinement.
Hey, and Mark, we're probably about 30 seconds to a minute away from the end of our show. You want to wrap it up for us? You got anything you want to say to tie a bow on it all?
Yeah, just that. Wow, there's so much to talk about with this particular story. But if you go to the No Political Repression website, it's called the Committee Against Political Repression at WordPress. They have a lot of information up there about a recent affidavit that was released to the public on order of Judge Richard Jones, and it talks about FBI surveillance of anarchists in Oregon especially, and their use of terms like Oregon conspirators and sort of the kind of jargon that you were using before in terms of sort of casting people in a criminal light, even though there is no evidence of criminal activity, that kind of thing. Associates and conspirators is another phrase that was used. Uh-huh. So that's another very important story that people should probably check out, because it's not being reported.
Can you send me an email with links for all of these stories, Mark, and I'll put them on the podcast notes?
Sure.
All right.
No problem.
Very good.
That would be great.
So I guess we ought to do a station ID.
Hey, let's let Ethan do it. Have you listened to it often enough, Ethan? Station ID time.
Oh, hello. This is KWVA
88.1. There you go.
FM.